Okay, so good morning. Um, we're going to talk about the lives of St. Francis, and you might be surprised by the plural form of lives, but this comes from the Latin word vitae, which means lives, that relate to the actually the different biographies that have been written about St. Francis, and we'll go more into it pretty soon. So on October 3rd, 1226, the word was out. Francesco il Poverello had died. Through this new order that he had dedicated to poverty and penance, and was marked, as you know, by a very profound love for all things that belong to God, the one who was called the other Christ had brought grace and spiritual abundance to all. Already on July 16th, 1228, which means not even 2 years after his death, Francis was canonized by Pope Gregory IX. The day after his canonization, on July the 17th, 1228, on the hill called Collis Inferni, so which means the hill of hell, the Pope laid the foundation stone for the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi. The plans, by the way, were very well advanced. And the name of the hill was transformed from hell to Collis Paradisi, the hill of paradise. We have to understand that Assisi, that you see, it's a beautiful view with the monastery at the very front. Assisi, as many of the cities in the north of Italy, were part of the constant battle between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Guelphs and the Ghibellines were two factions, the Guelphs holding on for the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Ghibellines holding on for the Pope. And in many of these cities, depending on who was the leader, the power would shift from the Ghibellines to the Guelph. And a good example is the story of Romeo and Juliet, where the two families belong, one to the Guelphs, the other to the Ghibellines, and we're not talking. This was a very, very harsh period for that things. Assisi had gone back and forth between the two. By the time Francis is born, Assisi was part of the Ghibellines, so was owned by the papal state. So the Pope had planned to make in Assisi, after the death of St. Francis, build a church that would be called Specialis Ecclesiae. Specialis Ecclesiae. And this was going to hold the relics of St. Francis, but was going to be a particular church where actually the Pope would even have, the Pope would have special privileges, and he would have a throne dedicated to him. So what he wanted to do in that is assert his presence in the center of Italy. There is some politics in there, we have to understand. There's only at that time 2 decades that the Pope had regained control on that territory. And so Assisi, being well in the center, would really have a place to just confirm the power of the Pope. At the time, sorry, here. Yeah. And here you have a beautiful view on the monastery and then the basilica, which dominates the monastery. At the time they decided to build the church, the Franciscan, the followers, which were not called yet the Franciscan, were divided between 2 different factions. One was um, the spirituals that had made an absolute vow of poverty, which was really following very closely what St. Francis had done. And then you had the conventuals that had a need for a permanent church and convent. Originally, as we know, Francis went along, and we'll see the kind of path he did. He moved a lot within the center of Italy. He was not, he didn't belong to a particular monastery at that time. And so you have these two factions, one who wants the convent and the church, the other one who wants absolute poverty, not owning anything. So as the idea of building a church came, the spirituals didn't want that. And of course, the conventual really liked it. So because they couldn't decide between them, it was pretty much the judgment of Solomon, the Pope decided, okay, if you can't take a decision, then I'll become the patron and owner of the basilica. And that's why it's a basilica. It has special privileges that are granted by the Pope. So the construction was supervised by Brother Elias of Cortona, who was one of the first followers of St. Francis, and was a vicar general of the order in 1232, so shortly after the death of Francis. But because of extreme thought at the time, and probably not very straightforward facts, deeds, he was excommunicated in 1244, but then was able to come back. So in 1230, Gregory IX took San Francesco under his protection and declared it the papal property. He defined the church as what we called caput and mater, literally head and mother of the Franciscan order. The lower basilica that you enter through this gate, by the way, was finished in 1230, so very rapidly, though they had to really dig into the rock to make it. And on the Pentecost, on the 25th of May, 1230, the remains of St. Francis were brought in a solemn procession to the lower basilica from its temporary burial place in the Santa Clara, the Church of San Giorgio, which is now the Basilica of San Clara of Assisi. They had to keep it very severely controlled, the burial of St. Francis, even before it was moved here, because people wanted a relic, so wanted something that belonged to him, even a piece of his body, if it was possible. So this was pretty extreme. They transported it into the lower basilica and hid the place where he was buried. It wasn't concealed. And actually, they even lost track of where it was. It was only rediscovered in the 19th century, early 19th century, when it was, they finally found the entrance to his burial, and they put his remains in a special crypt that is now visible, and that was later surrounded by his closest friars. The construction of the upper basilica that you see on the upper level was completed around 1246, but the Pope, Innocent IV by that time, that had been forced out of Italy, couldn't come to the inauguration, so they had to wait until 1253 for the inauguration of the upper church. At that time, that church was one of the most lavish buildings around. And this is only explained because it was made for the Pope. So you have the dates up above. The plan of the church is a simple nave, so you don't have any aisles, as you can see, but it has a transept, so it has the plan of, the Roman basilica, if we go on, or the early the old St. Peter. This is exactly the same type of model. And this will remain a model for Franciscan churches that very rarely have aisles. As you can see, the windows are not as large as what you find in many Gothic church. This is a Gothic church. But there is an enormous space that can be dedicated to frescoes, and therefore to literally teach people about the life of St. Francis. By the way, the stained glass windows were made by German craftsmen. We have different programs. We have on the top part, on either side of the windows, we have scenes of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And this is, of course, a progression towards the life of St. Francis, which at that time was considered as a second Christ. Now, this very lavish decoration must have been planned before 1260, when the Edict of Narbonne decided that the Franciscan church had to remain almost without decoration at all. It had to show poverty, which was the dedication of the saint. Originally, at just past the transept, you would have had a large screen that would have kept the congregation of the Franciscan separated from the numerous pilgrims that were coming into the church. That was finally removed in the 15th century. Unfortunately, as you, I think, all remember, in 1997, a terrible earthquake took its toll on the cathedral, on the basilica. I'm just going to show you that because it's an extraordinary image. This terrible event had a positive result, is that a lot of restorers and art historians had, after that terrible earthquake, access to the frescoes and were able to analyze them. And we'll see how it will have an impact on the dedication of who we thought the paintings were made by. So this is here the little, hopefully it's gonna work.
Basilica of St. Francis. The team stands below a gaping hole in the vault over the altar as the shattered remains of priceless frescoes dating to the early Renaissance litter the floor. It's a heartbreaking loss, but the real heartbreak has only begun, as once again, out of nowhere, a second quake strikes Assisi, putting everyone inside at its mercy. Terrified men and women flee for the exits. News videographer Paolo Antolini points his camera upward just as the ceiling comes crashing down, enveloping the entire scene in a cloud of dust and rubble.
Everyone started running out the door. I didn't run out because I was too far away to exit quickly.
At least a dozen people, including architect Centroni, were standing under the vault when it collapsed. Paolo had moved far back in the basilica to get a wider angle shot with his camera. And now he's alone in the dark until he hears the screams.
So this absolutely terrible event killed actually 4 people and made a tremendous damage. We say that last bay of the vault they had to put together all the fragments that they found on the floor and try to put it back together. It also damaged the upper frescoes around the windows. But the question had been for a long time if the whole life of St. Francis had been painted by Giotto. Vasari, the art historian of the 16th century, had credited Giotto with painting this. But a lot of other people said it is not his hand, it is not his way of painting. There was, we know, a consensus when they decorated, when they actually commissioned painters to come and decorate the church. They should not paint with their very own style, but with a common style so that the work could be comprehensive and would look uniform. So we have to keep in mind a few things. Is first of all, as we said, the San Francesco Basilica was commissioned by the Pope. Unfortunately, all the archives that were in the convent were destroyed during the Napoleonic invasion. I mentioned the fact that Vasari is the one who credited Giotto with authorship, though Giotto was only 25. But Vasari was always giving the central place to Tuscan artists. However, as the Pope comes from Rome, it makes a lot of sense to bring in famous Roman painters, and there were many famous Roman painters at that time. Unfortunately, most of their works has been destroyed when they were remodeling some of the churches, and we only have a few examples of that. So following that earthquake, there was an analysis of the fresco made by Bruno Zanardi that came to very interesting conclusion. First of all, as I mentioned to you, when painters paint a fresco, it's putting a layer of fine plaster over a more coarse plaster. So this is called, that fine plaster is called the intonaco, with a very fine grain. To paint, the plaster has to be wet to put the pigment on it. And so they would apply the intonaco on the wall for only what a painter could do in one day. So in Italian, they call it a giornata, something you do in one day. Bruno Zanardi came with the idea there were 546 giornate just for the cycle of St. Francis. Also, he found that 3 different styles of templates were used. For all the figures that you have in these, they had this type of templates made out of parchments or wood, depending. And so they would just outline them, turn them around, have another one, and then modify it slightly so it would have a personality. But there were 3 very different styles of templates that were used. There were also 3 distinct formulae of colors. After doing the analysis, they found out it was a different thing. So the conclusion is that there were 3 masters with their workshops that were working on these frescoes. The greater part of the cycle was painted by the second of the 3 masters employed on the work. When they analyzed the brushstrokes that was used to create the facial expressions, they realized it was completely different to the ones that Giotto would apply, who was himself building up a series of very thin strokes. But on the other hand, they found that they were very similar to a remnant of frescoes that are absolutely superb, by the way, in Santa Cecilia in Trastevere, that was painted by the superb Roman painter Cavallini. And so we know that Cavallini was one of the 3 masters, and there are some other painters like Jacopo Torriti and Giacomo, who were also a painter. Torriti, by the way, being a Franciscan priest as well, a monk at least. So we now pretty much have the proof that these were 3 Roman masters who came and worked with their workshops on these frescoes. So looking at the first bay. So you have each contains either 3 or 4 images that tells the story of the legend of St. Francis. Now, who wrote that legend? The first one who wrote legend was Tommaso de Celano, of Gelano. He wrote actually 3 different books. The first life, which is called The Life of Blessed Francis, that was written literally 2 years after his death. The second life is the memorial of the desire of a soul concerning the deeds and words of our most holy Father Francis. This was written a little later, and was actually commissioned by the Minister General of the Franciscan Order. And that one actually in there had the legend of the 3 companions and the legend of Perugia. It includes episodes of the cross of San Damiano and so on. And then the last one is the treatise on the miracles of the Blessed Francis, that really writes a whole series of miracles that happened between his death and the time he was canonized and went on. And this was written around 1253. So Thomas was not among the earliest disciples of Francis, but he joined the Franciscans around 1215 and met the saint, obviously, during his lifetime. He was later sent to Germany and promote the new order over there. And in 1223 was named the sole guardian of the order's Rhineland province. The second one was Bonaventura de Bagnoregio, and he wrote the Legenda Major that was written around 1263. Why was that particular biography written? Is that the University of Paris, which was very powerful at the time, didn't care about the way the Tommaso de Celano was writing. They wanted another image of Francis. They wanted, in a sense, a messianic vision of St. Francis, really making a parallel between Christ and Francis. They actually, once Bonaventura's book was written, they decided to burn every single volume written by Tommaso de Celano, so that there would be no contradiction between the 2 biographies. Fortunately for us, the Benedictine that already had collected some of the works of the Chilano never gave them back and kept it. And so this is how we know about that autobiography. And then the last one was written by Uggiolino before 1390, and it's called The Little Flowers of Francis of Assisi. This is a classic collection of popular legends about the life of St. Francis. Now, depending on the artist and the person or the patron, they decide to take the information from one of these biographies, and I'll try to point out what it was. In this case, they follow the biography of Bonaventura da Bagnoregio. So let's look in detail at the story. So the homage of a simple man is really interesting.
Amazon Photos is not supported on this device. View
Alexa,
your photos
stop.
using the app. Amazon Photos is not supported on this device. View your photos
Alexa,
using
stop.
the Amazon.
Sorry for that. The first image there is the homage of a simple man, and it shows a simple man who spread out his cloak so that the St. Francis can walk on it, so it doesn't have to walk into the puddle. You can see people around him not understanding why that young man suddenly has the privilege. What is so interesting in this particular image is the fact that the artist has really looked at the architecture in Assisi in the background. So we can see here what is considered the Temple of Minerva. The Temple of Minerva was an old Roman temple dedicated to Minerva. And as we can see at the time of St. Francis, it had been turned into a jail. As you can see, there are some grids at the window. We also know that the tower here is not finished. And so that gives us an idea of when the painting was done. And if we look at Assisi, this is the actual main square of Assisi with the temple that has been now turned into a church, and is called Santa Maria sopra Minerva. Now the tower has gained one more level, and so it's always interesting because you can see when the painting was done. We know when the Torre del Popolo was finished in 1305. So this was painted prior to 1305. The second image shows St. Francis giving his mantle to a poor man. So I'm going to go back into the history of St. Francis. He was born from a family, a rather well-to-do family of silk merchant. And his father was, of course, expecting him to follow in his footsteps. But St. Francis, who at first led a life of leisure and as any young man, you know, they just had lots of friends and probably had lots of experiences too, as any of these would have, suddenly realized that there were a lot of poor people. What happened too is he was caught in that battle between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The closest city to Assisi was Perugia, and Perugia was Guelph when Assisi was Ghibelline. So they would fight a lot. And Francis, when he was 19, took part to that battle. You know, they had to show their courage, and was made prisoner and spent a year in Perugia in prison. And this gave him some time to think about life. And when he came out of it, he saw a very different life with a very different eye. And he realized that there was a lot of poverty around him. So that second scene is just confirming the fact he's meeting that poor man, who is a knight, by the way, and he immediately gives his mantle to the poor man. And he's going to do a lot of these type of things, literally, where he's in charge of selling the silks from his father's business. He is going to often go and sell the silks and then take the money and distribute it to poor people. So here we can see the scene. So he's outside the walls of the city. Assisi was walled in as any of the cities of the time. And we have that beginning of a lovely landscape, kind of a rocky landscape, but with little trees and so on. Keep in mind that, of course, the blue that you have at the back, by the way, was painted secco, which means once the plaster was dried, then they could apply blue, because otherwise it would react with the chemical reaction of the drying plaster. And so they had to wait until it was dry to apply the blue. There was no really rich blue that would hold on otherwise. And the third scene is showing St. Francis sleeping and getting a vision with God. It shows him in a dream a magnificent palace full of armor bearing the sign of Christ's cross. You can see them here on that terrace. And the dream was to tell him that the compassion he had shown towards the poor knight would soon be rewarded by a great gift. This castle will be for him and his follower. But of course, the young man misunderstands the message, and he is hoping for knighthood and glory. And in fact, this is the dialogue between God and Francis. Francis, is it better to serve the Lord or the servant? The Lord, of course. Then why are you turning on you to your Lord into why are you turning your Lord into a servant, sir? Lord, what do you want me to do? Return to Assisi. It is revealed to you that you are to do and what you will come to understand the meaning of this vision. And this is long time I haven't done this one. There we are. So the second triad, if you want, of the legend shows a very important moment in the life of St. Francis, is when he enters a very small church that is in very bad shape. The little church is called San Damiano. And Francis goes and prays in front of the crucifix and hears a voice that says, "Go and repair my church, which, as you can see, is all in ruins." Of course, again, there is a young man, he doesn't understand the second level of the message of God. He thinks indeed that chapel church is in bad shape, it's falling apart. And so he thinks that physically he has to restore the church. And in fact, what he does, again, he goes, gets some of the beautiful fabric from his father, sells it, and then brings the money to the priest who's in charge of the chapel to repair the chapel. His father finds out, he's very, very unhappy. But Francis doesn't realize that what God wants is him to repair the church with a capital C, that right now the Catholic Church is falling apart because it's become a very elitist organization that has lost this message to the poor. So this cross, by the way, still exists and is now hanging into the Santa Chiara church in Assisi, so in the church that is linked to the monastery for the Sinclairs, the Poor Clares, another order that will be organized by Francis. And so this is the original. In the old Santa Damiano church is a copy, and you can see another copy of the same crucifix if you go to the new church of the Franciscans here in Phoenix. They have a copy of the San Damiano cross. So the next episode is, the father suddenly realizes that his son is selling the fabrics and giving the money around. And so he cannot understand that. And so he goes after his son. And his son decides that he is going to live in poverty. He surrenders all his clothes that you can see on the arm of his father. And the bishop is behind him, quickly takes his clothes and, to keep him modest, surrounds him with part of his coat. The father is, of course, not happy at all, and he's restrained by some friends or family member. So what happens at that time is Francis is showing, and you can see hidden behind the letters, you see the hand of God going towards Francis and says, "Listen to me, everybody. Until now, I have called Pietro Bernardone, who is my father. But now that I'm determined to serve God, I return not only his money, but all the clothes I have from him. From now on, I can walk naked before the Lord, no longer saying, my Father Pietro Bernardone, but our Father who are in heaven. So this is really the moment where Francis decides to go his own way. So very quickly, people are going to follow Francis. He's going to be given a tunic. He's not going to go around in, naked. And he's going to go, and his idea is not only to talk to people, to look at nature and look at and understand that they are poor and sick people, but he also is going to take care of the lepers and other people that were sick in the surroundings. As they are getting more and more members in his group, they decide, he writes some rules and decides he has to go to Rome to get the approval of the Pope. And so while he arrives in Rome, fortunately with the help of the Bishop of Assisi, the Pope, who is, you can see here, laying down, has a dream. He has a dream that the Basilica of the St. Lateran, which was at that time the domicile, if you want, of the Pope, the residence of the Pope, the Lateran is toppling, and it's that strange man with a tunic that is holding it up on his shoulder. This, by the way, that detail doesn't come from Bonaventura, the book, but from another source, because Bonaventura has normally St. Francis holding it with his back, not with his shoulder. And these were very detailed. So following the dream of Innocent III, that says, truly, this is he who by his work and teaching shall sustain the Church of Christ. So this is a very important dream here for the Pope, who, sorry, again, I'm messing up, but there we are. And gives now to the next chapter, showing the confirmation of the rule. So following the dream, the Pope decides, okay, I can receive that young man with his followers, though many bishops around him were trying to prevent Francis to come by. And he is agreeing to give him a chance. He says, you have to refine these rules, but what we're going to do is we're going to cut your hair and giving the tonsure, which is, the tonsure is that hairstyle very typical of the Franciscan friars, that were actually giving them the authority of preaching. If they didn't have the tonsure, they wouldn't be allowed to preach and they could be arrested for it. So Francis and his companions go back to Assisi and the surrounding of Assisi and are going to go on with their beautiful deeds to take care of the lepers and preach for humanity, preach for the word of God all around the place. So the next, so this is the words of the Pope: go with the Lord, brothers, and preach penance to all as the Lord will inspire you. Then when the Lord increases you in number and in grace, return joyously to me, and at that time I will concede more to you and commit greater things to you more confidently. The next image shows a dream. You have a series of friars who are in that very small location, asleep. And then some others come out and have that vision of a chariot pulled by some horses and Francis in it. And this tells them that the saint will be the guide and the new leader of Christianity. Another vision that has to do with Francis is the following here, with a monk that has entered an abandoned church with Francis to pray, and in a moment he has that religious vision, seeing a number of thrones in heaven, one of which in the center is higher and prettier than the others, and the voice told him that it was reserved for the humble Francis. So a lot of images, as you can see. Other miracle, and you could only be canonized if you had made a certain number of miracles, so these were important. The next one is the exorcism of the demon at Arezzo. That view shows actually the city of Arezzo very much as it is with all the towers, competing towers, and we see the devils being chased. Francis at that time is showing a lot of modesty, because he doesn't want to be the one actually to do that miracle. And he pushes one of his brother, Sylvester, to drive the demons out. And you can see that the city is separated from the rest by that crack in the ground. So Francis is praying, and it's brother Sylvester who is chasing the demons. Francis, as much as he wanted to fight when he was young, wanted to die as a martyr. And so during the time of the, in the 12th century, during the time of the Crusades, in 1219, he traveled with the Crusaders and tried to go to North Africa and tried to preach to the Muslims that were there, but twice had to come back, once because he was sick, the other one because the ship sank. But the third time he was able to go to Marietta in northern Egypt, and went across the lines of the Crusaders and ended up being invited in by the Sultan, tried to convert him. And one of the ways was to show that he, as St. Francis, could walk through the fire. And he, in a sense, challenged the priest, the Muslim priest, to do the same, which you can see he's not doing. And of course, he left alive, but didn't convert the Sultan, though some legends say that the Sultan converted on his deathbed. It is also very interesting, though, because following the presence of Francis in North Africa, in Egypt, and then coming back through Palestine, it triggered the fact that the Franciscan order has been present in the Holy Land almost uninterruptedly since 1217, when Brother Elias arrived at Acre, and they're still the one in charge of the Holy Sepulchre. Often at night, Francis would seek out some lonely place to meditate and to pray. And on one occasion, his brother friar saw him praying so fervently with his arms stretched out that suddenly he was wrapped in a luminous cloud and raised off the ground. And then they show Christ reaching down in an act of blessing. And then for us, this is something really special. Francis is also credited for having done the first crib, the first nativity scene in one of these live nativity scenes. We see here in Greccio, this is about 3 years before his death. He tried to encourage a spirit of worship in ordinary people. So before he arrived in Greccio, Francis had a crib set up in a cave, complete with a manger and a real ox and donkey. It was observed that he took a sleeping child from the crib and roasted it. He thus started a tradition which continues to this day of preparing a crib at Christmas time in memory of Christ. This is it's a very interesting image altogether. Of course, the scale is quite interesting because the donkeys and the oxen are very, very tiny. You can see the child is a live child. And this takes place in the choir of a church. This is the famous screen that would separate typically the religious community from the pilgrims or from the regular people. And this is where the wood cross would be. You see the back of it. It would be leaning towards the people so they could see. This is the way it was anchored. And then here's the pulpit where the priest would go up and talk to people, and you have the altar there. So really interesting. You see that women were not allowed in that space, just behind the door. So when the mass would take place, people couldn't see it. They could hear it, but not see it. This changed in the Counter-Reformation in the 16th century, when these were removed. At the very end of the basilica, this is where the famous terrible accident happened. You have two scenes, the miracle of the spring and the sermon to the bird, which are, of course, showing very much the approach to nature that Francis has. In this case, it is also a miracle. One day, Francis was not well, and he rode up the mountain retreat. This is in Laverna, on a donkey that was lent to him by a peasant, and you can see the peasant there, who followed on foot. And he was the poor one suffering from the heat, and so he pleaded for a drink. And Francis got off the donkey and knelt to pray, and there the water sprang from the bare rock. The spring was never found again. On the other side, it's in a place close to Spoletto. St. Francis comes across a flock of birds that did not fly away at his approach, and he gave a sermon to these waiting creatures and received the blessing of the saint. And this is the image we have so often of Francis talking to the birds and being so close to the creatures of God. On the other side, we see the scenes here of the death of the Knight of Chilano. This is again some of the miracles made by Francis. He was preaching in Chilano and invited to a knight who lived in that neighborhood for a meal. And as Francis had that vision that the knight would soon die, he asked him to make his confession and to set his household affairs in order. And as you can see here, we see the knight dying to the confusion of everybody. Being in front of the Pope Honorius III, Francis had prepared a beautiful sermon. However, he lost the thread of what he was saying and had to improvise. And his sermon captivated everyone and convinced them that the Spirit of God really spoke through him. And so you can see the attention that the Pope and his disciples have listening to Francis. The apparition at Arles shows actually St. Anthony, who was also a Franciscan, preaching and teaching some other monks. And suddenly he has an apparition of St. Francis. St. Francis is seen only, as you can see, by St. Anthony. The others keep looking at St. Anthony and not at all at Francis. In early September 1224, Francis retires in Laverna. It is a rather wild and savage mountain, not very far from Arezzo. A local nobleman had donated a spot for a hermitage, and he is preparing for the feast of St. Michael the Archangel, and his prayer is the key to whom is to who he is. Oh Lord, I beg you 2 graces before I die, to experience fully and in all possible fullness the pains of your bitter passion, and to feel for you the same love that moved you to sacrifice yourself for us. At that time, suddenly there is that vision. As you can see, the other friar doesn't really see what's happening, but there is the appearance of Christ with the arms in the shape of a cross, and he's surrounded by seraphs. As you can see, seraphs has 7 wings, is really surrounding him. And suddenly some rays of light are going to hit Francis. And this is the moment where he's supposed to have received the stigmata. This is really the high point of the life of St. Francis. And this is where he becomes really the imitatio Christi, so the really moment where he becomes a second Christ. It is about that time that he's going to compose one of his most known canticle, the Canticle of the Sun, which is absolutely beautiful. Most high, all powerful, good Lord, yours are the praise, the glory, the honor, and all blessing. To you alone, most high, do they belong, and no man is worthy to mention your name. Be praised, my Lord, through all your creatures, especially through my Lord brother Sun, who brings the day, and you give light through him, and he is beautiful and radiant in all his splendor. Of you, most high, he bears the likeness. Praise be you, my Lord, through sister moon and the stars in heaven. You form them clear and precious and beautiful. Praise be you, my Lord, through brother wind and through the air, cloudy and serene, and every kind of weather through which you give sustenance to your creature, and so on and so on. It's absolutely beautiful, and you can find it online if you want. He had, Francis had been raised, his mother was French, by the way, and so he had been raised with a lot of French culture, including a lot of poetry, Boccaccio, etc. No, this is precedes Boccaccio, sorry, Petrarch. And he is very much using the type of, so he's also, Petrarch is also later, but he's looking at the troubadours and very much the same type of poetry that the troubadours were using in France. Going on with these, we're coming to, of course, the very hard moment of the death of St. Francis. Francis had been sick for quite a while. He was almost blind. He had a disease of the eye that made him almost blind, and was also suffering from kidney problems. And so very young, he was in his mid-40s when he died. And we can see here the terrible moment where all his brethren are grieving around his body. His body was moved at that time in what is called the very small church that is encased within that large Basilica of St. Mary of the Angels that is close to Assisi. Inside is the Portiuncola, that very small church that used to be the church that was surrounded by some of the little huts occupied by the brethren. And so that church has been literally surrounded by the huge church of St. Mary of the Angels, and you can visit it. Inside, you have by Ilario da Viterbo, the Santa Maria degli Angeli, the particular fresco showing the Annunciation to Mary. With the life of the Virgin and St. Francis around. And here you can see these little huts. We'll see these were surrounding the little place. So this is the original setting. This would be the Portulanca, here Assisi being in the background. And then you had the little huts that were the places where each of the brethren would live in the cells at the time of Francis. So to go on, after his death, there will be some miracles again. The apparition of Fra Agostino at the very moment when Francis died, a brother called Agostino that had been mute for years and was near death cried out, "Wait for me, Father, I want to go with you." Of course, also we have on the side the Bishop of Assisi that had a vision of Francis saying, "I'm leaving the world and going to heaven." Sorry, the next one. As often, there was always some people that didn't believe. And so when they heard that Francis had died, people flocked to witness the marks of Christ's passion. And many citizens of Assisi were permitted to contemplate and even kiss the stigmata. Around them, a knight that you see here at the very front, named Gelano, was a doubter. And just like Thomas, he insisted to touch the stigmata. And when he was there, he realized this was real. You can see again the root cross in the images of Mary and of the angel Michael. Sorry again. Never mind. Now, as we know, very early on, Francis had quite an influence on many people, including another person from Assisi, Clara, who was from a very good family in Assisi and became extremely smitten by the sermons of Francis. And one night left the house of her parents to come to Francis and say that she wanted to follow him. And of course, at that time, women were absolutely not allowed to live as freely. So shortly, he first put her with some Benedictine nuns, but then she didn't like their way of life, which was luxurious. And he organized in actually San Damiano a convent for women, and very quickly the number increased. Santa Clara remained an extremely close friend to Francis, and the story goes that when he died, his remains were brought into Assisi and stopped in front of the convent where Santa Clara could come and say her goodbye to him. Very quickly after his death, as you know, he was canonized, and this is unfortunately extremely damaged fresco, but that shows the canonization of the Francis. And then we have the dream Just before he canonized Francis, Gregory had some doubts about the marks of Christ's wounds in his side. And so he had a dream in which Francis appeared to set his mind at rest. Francis said, "Give me an empty flask." Gregory did as he was asked, and the bottle was miraculously filled with blood from the wound of Francis' side. And this is what you see here. And to quickly finish, these are 3 more scenes showing some miracle. I'm not going to go too long because we have so much more to see. But the curing of a man from Lerida, again, praying, his wife praying for her dying husband, and Francis appears and is curing him. Here is a woman who is ready to die, but Francis is going to keep her alive enough that she can confess. And in this case, it's the liberation of the heretic Pietro, despite the fact he's guarded and imprisoned. He's going to be liberated by Francis, that you can see on the very top. Sorry. At the very end of the church, you have the painting then of St. Francis and Santa Clara next to one another. At the bottom, and I'm going to stop here for a minute, we'll go a little faster on the rest because now you have an idea of the history of Francis. So this is the plan of the Lower Basilica, where we're going to see some more works that relate to Francis. And quickly, the crypt. So you go, when you're at the Lower Basilica, you have to go down some steps, and here's the crypt, where the tomb of St. Francis is in the center, and around him, the tombs of his closest brethren. So on these, I'm going to, you can unmute yourself. So if you want some question, go and get a cup of coffee, a glass of water. If you want to ask me some questions, just unmute yourself and go on. Don't be shy. I don't bite.
Anne,
Yes.
the question I have is because when you started, you described the 3 works that seem to be the 3 biographies.
Yes.
And the evolution of the paintings that you just took us through seem to be from the second Bonaventura. Am I right?
The biography used as a base for the iconography is the one from Bonaventura.
Okay.
So the biographies, as I said, the Chilano are going to be destroyed, most of them. Fortunately, the work had already been given to the Benedictines, and it's through the Benedictines that they will be able to get some copies of the Tommaso de Celano biography. Otherwise, we would not be able to even know what was written.
Okay.
The one by Bonaventura is a much more political view of Francis, political in this religious sense, where they really make his image. Whereas the first one is a much more spontaneous biography.
But even that, I mean, the first paintings, they seem to be a dominance of the spiritual.
Yeah, but that's the whole idea.
And towards the end,
it's a much more mystical approach by Bonaventura than the first biography that was made, which was more historical.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
I am. So, any other questions?
Well, if nobody has,
Go on.
You showed the Sermon of the Birds.
Yes.
And I've seen Sermon of the Birds with a St. Francis kind of a more standing up straight. Are there many versions of the Sermon of the Birds?
We're going to see. Now I'm going to quickly see what's in the Lower Basilica, and then we're going to go through a whole series of other paintings that actually follow one or the other biography.
Okay.
But the standing or being bent down, that's probably purely an artistic representation. that has nothing to do with the biography itself.
Thank you.
Yes, Anne, you had a question?
This is totally unrelated, but whenever they don't have January, I guess, on the Scottsdale Artist School to sign up for the spring semester yet.
Oh, they don't. Okay, I thought they had put up the thing. You have received the schedule, so at least you know.
Yes.
I'm going to contact them right away. They've been really busy with the fundraiser the last weeks, but they should now be set on the site.
Well, also, I've tried to donate, and I pushed the button about 6 times yesterday, and nothing. It never went further than that to actually go to PayPal or something
That's
like that.
interesting.
So it's a terrible website.
I know, and they realize it. Unfortunately, they have inherited it. And so it's very difficult for them, to do. But if you don't mind, go on the Scottsdale Artist School site and call them and tell them.
Okay.
And they probably
I
can
can just
help.
do it over the phone then.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. So I don't know how many of you have been down in the crypt, but it's quite an experience. It's because it used to be covered with marble. During the Baroque period, they had covered everything with marble, and then finally they realized it was not in the spirit of Francis, and so they removed all that, and it's now just the stone and brick. So it's a much closer to Francis' spirit than it was before, and it's a very special place, I have to admit. You don't need to be a believer to feel the spirit.
And have you
Yes.
seen the one for Saint Clair?
I've been in the church. I've been in the church, but I haven't been in the crypt.
It's very different. I mean, it's all white marble and very fancy, but it smells terrible down there.
Hi, Sandra. Sandra, how are you doing, Sandy?
Very well, thank you. Could you speak a little bit more about putting blue color in the frescoes? I had not heard this before.
Yes, there are some pigments that react chemically with the plaster. And so you cannot apply it when the plaster is wet. And one of the pigment is the blue, the ultramarine blue, which comes from lapis lazuli, has a chemical reaction. And also things that come from malachite have that same reaction. So there is an oxidation that happens when pigment comes in contact with the plaster and the plaster dries. If you've ever done anything with plaster, you can feel that it gets hot. I don't know, as a child, we used to make forms, with plaster. And when you mix it and so on, and you put it in these rubber pouches, you can feel the heat that's happening. So that's the chemical reaction. Same thing on the wall. And so they had to wait until the plaster was dry and then applied that particular blue secco, dry.
Is that still true today?
Yeah, unless they have a lot of, you don't have ultramarine blue made from lapis lazuli anymore. They make it a different way. So with the paintings nowadays, and I don't know exactly which one pigment they use when they do, but it's a different process. You use actually almost something like watercolors, if you want, or gouache. But you don't use all the same pigment that they were, because so many were so dangerous. So they have modified the pigments now, but that's only since the 19th century.
But just the layperson looking at a fresco wouldn't be able to tell the difference, would they?
Yeah, the problem is when something is as old as that, we're talking about 13th century work, with the time and the humidity and so on, when it's secco, applied secco, it flakes off. So that's the problem.
Thank you.
They're welcome. But you know, it's just like porcelain, for example, when you have the beautiful porcelain, and we'll talk about that in January when I give porcelain. You can bake at very, very high temperature almost everything but red and gold. So when you were painting porcelain, and that's why you can't put them in your dishwasher, because when you were painting porcelain, you would paint everything, but not the red and the gold. And then once it was baked at very high temperature, they were painting it with the gold and the red, and at much lower temperature, they would bake that. And so that's why if you put your porcelain in dishwasher, it fades away because it doesn't bake at the same high temperature. You see, you learn something every time.
I know.
Okay, so we're going to go on because I have so much more. So let's mute you again. And we can talk on after the end. So here is the Lower Basilica, which is also beautiful. So as you know, finished earlier than the upper, makes sense. Sorry, let me come with my notes here. And so you have a double door to come into that basilica, and it was modified quite severely here because we have actually on the walls, we had a series of the life of St. Francis also predating the one we've seen upstairs, but then they started building the chapels that are in there, and in doing so had to go through these frescoes. Sorry, why do I go so fast? So we find here, we don't know who the painter is, but these are what is left of that very early version. So it's about 30 years older than the ones we've seen upstairs. We called it the Master of St. Francis because we don't know who he is, and he's only known for these frescoes showing this is the renunciation of worldly goods. So it's when Francis is wrapped by the bishop in front of his father. As you can see, part of it has been cut off. Here we have Francis preaching to the bird. As you can see, he's more erect than in the other one. The Francis received the stigmata. We only see the seraph there in Christ. And then the funeral of St. Francis. As you can see, a very different style. Here is that the whole series of frescoes made by different artists, including Cimabue, Lorenzetti, and Giotto, at least maybe not Giotto himself, but his workshop. So here is the earliest painting by a painter we know. This is the famous Cimabue, who did also the choir in the upper basilica, and shows a Madonna enthroned with the child, St. Francis on one side and 4 angels. A different style. This is, of course, predating Giotto, and at that time, Cimabue was considered the most extraordinary painter that existed until Giotto came about. And often we see that pictures of St. Francis, we see it isolated as just one image of Francis. The vault, the central vault of the Lower Basilica, shows Franciscan allegories, and I'm going to go quickly through it. It is not by the hand of Giotto, but probably his workshop. And it shows the different allegories with poverty, chastity, and obedience. And in the first one, sorry, I'm going first here. And I'm going the apotheosis of St. Francis, which is the very first one, showing St. Francis surrounded by angels. Now we can go to the next one. The next one shows the Allegory of Chastity. In a very well-fortified castle, the chastity rules. And you can see Castitas. Only the angels can enter there. And in order to reach her, a long path must be followed. And you have the representatives of the three divisions of the Franciscan orders. Lay brother, Franciscan, and Clare have climbed the hill. As you can see, so they climbing the hills here, the three of them. And then you have the baptism in the center. They will be washed and dressed by angel. On the other side, you have figures of demons and cast into the abyss. And they are unchasteness, immundita, that you can see here. And with the boar's head is immundicia, unchasteness, burning desire with the flaming head, and love, amor, with the cloud feet, here, the one at the front. So a lot of symbolism, of course. The next one is the Allegory of Poverty, so central to the message of Francis. Holy poverty stands above all virtue, that prepare in us a dwelling place for God, and it is right that it stands first, both in place and in name, among all other gospel virtues. In the very center, you can see the marriage of Francis and poverty. She's a very gaunt woman dressed in only rags. And actually, typically there are kids that are throwing stones to her. And then you have lots of angels and the personification of hope and chastity that are there as witnesses. And finally, the last one is obedience, Allegory of Obedience, which is also, these are the three rules for Francis. And these are also the meaning, when you see the tunic of the Franciscans, they wear a belt. And along the belt, that hang from the belt are three knots. And these are knots that mean poverty, chastity, and obedience. So here you see their symbolism. So, and you have in the chapter house of the cloister obedience rules between two observers, the dual face prudence, prudentia, and the quiet humility. So dual face, this is the prudence. And then on the other side, quiet humility. And obedience commands silence and places the yoke upon the monks who kneels before her. And you can see Francis observing all this. And of course, you have all kind of special creatures there. This is man with the body of a horse. Other of the paintings that show Francis by Lorenzetti, the great artist contemporary with Giotto, but working mostly in Siena. We have here Madonna and Child with Francis and John the Baptist, and down below Madonna with St. Francis and St. John the Evangelist with the donors down below. So all these paintings were made again and again in these areas. So the basilica was decorated little by little, not all at once. And this is another of the Lorenzetti, a part of the cycle that probably has disappeared, is the Stigmata of Francis, as you can see, pretty similar to the one that is up above. Francis walked a lot, and it's amazing because everything was done by foot when you see. So Assisi is here. You see Perugia and that constant battle that was between Perugia and Assisi. All the trek that he had to go just to go to Rome is quite interesting. The Greccio is about here. This is where he made that nativity scene. And then we have Spoletto, another place where he preached. Gubbio, we talked about. The Santuario della Verna is the place where he got his stigmata. And so these you have, this is actually a trip you can do the St. Francis Way. But there is also a place that is not on that place, and it's Subiaco. And this is where the earliest work representing Francis exists. And this is in that Sacro Specco, which is a Benedictine monastery, one of the very earliest Benedictine monastery that is really niched against the rock, as you can see. It's called the Sacro Specco. And this is one place where actually Benedict is known to have come and retired at times to stay away, to be able to meditate. They built that first monastery that's built within the rock. It's extraordinary. And not too far, there is a much larger abbey, the San Scholastica, that dates from the 12th to the 18th century. But it is there that is the oldest fresco that shows the portrait of Francis when he actually went by Subiaco to meditate, to be able to retire from all his followers. And this is done during his lifetime. It was done in 1224 to show you already the impact that Francis had. This is an extraordinary portrait. We have a description of Francis in some of, particularly the first biography, that says he wasn't very tall, he was very slim, he had large eyes, big ears, and eyes that were really giving a message, very fascinating eyes. So this is the very first portrait in that spectacular monastery of Subiaco. And there are a few more works that show also in Subiaco. This is a painting that was showing San Gregorio before he became Pope, that shows the Ugolino of Ostia, who becomes Pope later on. And we can see at the back here the view of Francis that has been added later on. So this head of Francis was added later on after his visit. As you can see, he has that same hood that they want to show. This gives him that strange headdress. Very quickly, you see, this is made in 1235, so it's not even 10 years after he died. Francis is inspiring lots of artists who are going to make these paintings showing the saint in the very center, in a very rigid and very stern way, which is responding to Bonaventura's. No, at that time, sorry, it's prior to the biography. So, but it's one way. This is a very early painting, so more Byzantine, corresponding to ideas more than to a presentation of a human being. And it is surrounded by scenes of his life, including the stigmata and different, the preaching to the birds, etc., etc. So these are very typical. They exist many. This is one of the earlier painter, Berlinghieri, in 1235. And it shows he's holding the rule that says, if any man will come after me, let him renounce self, take up his cross and follow me. Of course, in Santa Croce is a Franciscan church. In Florence, we see in the 13th century the building of two mendicant churches. In the north, we have Santa Croce. In the south, we have the Dominican church of Santa Maria Novella. And this church, of course, shows the typical pattern and plan of a Franciscan church. Very little aisles, as you want, a small transept. It's actually mimicking, in effect, the tunics that the Franciscans wear. And of course, we have the monastery buildings on the side. And in this church, we have, of course, this is another of the church that is incredibly decorated and not following the precepts of the Edict of Narbonne. But I think they found ways around it. And in the apse is surrounded by a whole series of chapels that were owned by the big families of Florence. And of course, there we have now the Bardi Chapel, this one, that is this time painted by Giotto and shows the whole cycle again of the life of Francis, though it is summarized compared to the one in Assisi. And here is, of course, the stigmatization of St. Francis. As you can see, the volume is evolving. This is a little later in Giotto's life, and you can see that knee protruding and the movement of the hands are less graphic and more three-dimensional. Unfortunately, with the number of centuries that these were done, some modification to the chapel existed. They put an altar where there was not, a tomb where there was not. So many of the frescoes were damaged. This shows the scene of the renunciation of the worldly goods of St. Francis. Pretty similar to what we've seen. We see the bishop surrounding the young man and then the father being restrained by some friends. This is a comparison between the one in Assisi and this one. So you can see it's different. Apparition of St. Francis in Arles. Again, we have St. Anthony. And as you can see, they're all looking at Anthony, but not at Francis. And then the death and ascension of St. Francis. You can see his soul being carried away by the angels. Confirmation of the rule, and you can see they have the tonsure. St. Francis before the Sultan. As you can see, the priest is leaving quickly, doesn't want to challenge Francis over the fire. And then the vision of the Ascension, unfortunately, has been damaged by a tomb that was put in front of it. In the very middle is another of this dorsal, as they call it, panel by this time Copo di Marcovaldo, showing Francis holding the his rules. And then you have a whole series of miracles and events of Francis' life. Later, we see Francis also just appearing some scenes of his life. Sometimes he's there as a patron saint surrounding Mary in one of these Sacra Conversazione. This is by Fra Angelico, Compagnia di San Francesco altarpiece, that shows in the predella, in the little panels below. This has been dismantled, unfortunately, but used to be all together. Francis is there with John the Baptist, but then down below you have a whole series of part of his life with the visiting the Sultan, the Stigmata. This is one that we're going to see. It's the encounter of Francis and Dominic that were contemporaries, and not everybody agrees, but we're pretty sure that they might have met very briefly. And then some miracles here and his death. Sassetta, this is this is still the early Renaissance. This was part of a whole altarpiece that was dismantled too. So we have the marriage of St. Francis to Lady Poverty, the stigmatization, which is of course one of the most important views. And then the ecstasy of St. Francis with a very different representation of Francis than what we have seen before, much a larger face, which he, according to Tommaso, wasn't the case. A beautiful series of frescoes in Montefalco, which is not far from Assisi, and by the way, was producing the wine that was drunk at the Mass for the Franciscans. Has an absolutely exquisite wine, by the way. And the church that was dedicated to St. Francis has become a museum. Inside, in the apse, is a complete cycle of the life of Francis, as you can see here. I'll give you access to this so you can go back at it. And this is the early works by Benozzo Gozzoli, who is also the one who painted the Medici Chapel and the Adoration of the Magi. It's absolutely extraordinary. The only thing that has changed is there was a stained glass window here that was part of the cycle, and unfortunately has been replaced. So we have lost that part. It was actually showing the stigmatization. And here is a whole series. I'm going to go rather quickly through it because we have a few more to show. This is just to give you an idea how they are set, facing one another in the end. So every time actually, as it is the case in Assisi, I didn't mention it, but you have an explanation, a sentence that tells what you see. So here's the translation. So how St. Francis was announced by Christ in the form of a pilgrim, and that he, like Christ himself, had to be born in a stable, and how a certain simple man spread his clothes out where St. Francis was walking. This is, of course, not the case. They show Francis being born in a stable. This is not true. Francis was born in a very well-to-do family in Assisi. But here is again the scene where we've seen Francis giving a chance to walk on the cross laid down by the simple man. Here is giving his clothes to the poor soldier. And then he has the dream, as we have said, with, in this case, coat of arms and crosses. The next chapter shows, of course, renouncing his father's inheritance. So we see this is already 150 years later. It's a different iconography and interpretation. Here, the encounter of St. Francis and St. Dominic that are there to renew the world. As you can see, the different uniform, different tunic between the Dominicans and the Franciscans. And of course, Dominicans mostly dedicating their life to preaching, whereas the Franciscan are there to mostly, they pray and they attend the poor. The rule and the life of the Minorites. So we see Francis holding the Lateran, the Palace of Lateran, and here they receive the rule and the benediction of the Pope. This is the driving the devils out of the city of Arezzo, with a beautiful landscape, by the way. St. Francis preaching to the birds and then blessed Montefalco and the population. Of course, this is in Montefalco, so it's important. And here's the city of Montefalco with a lovely landscape behind that. And by the way, Assisi up perched in the hills. The death of the Knight of Chilano. This is the representation of Christmas and the Christ child. As you can see, that the event that happened in Greccio, but in a very different setting. Of course, we are now in a Renaissance church, not as much as a Gothic church. The Sultan scene is interesting because now comes in a young lady that is supposed to tempt Francis. They received the stigmata, and of course, this is the piece that is all the way up and has been, unfortunately, trunked from the angel because of the removal of the stained glass window. And this is the death of St. Francis. On the ceiling, we have the display of different saints, St. Anthony of Padua, Santa Clara. I'm in the way for the other. It's St. Catherine of Siena and St. Louis of France. Ghirlandaio, we've seen him recently, also was asked by the patron to dedicate the Sassetti Chapel to St. Francis with the beautiful scene of the renunciation to earthly goods, the scene with the Sultan, the stigmata, the death of Francis, with the bishop having some glasses too, and the knight who doesn't, who is a doubter. The confirmation of the rules and the resurrection of the boy. This is, by the way, directly connected to the Sassetta family. Some manuscripts also show, this is an early manuscript that is kept in Perugia, actually showing Francis and other treating victims of leprosy. Some people thought it was the plague, but apparently it was leprosy. And they know that during the life of Francis, there were lots of lepers who were really left to die by themselves. The Bellini in Venice, also Giovanni Bellini made that wonderful painting of St. Francis in ecstasy, in a very Flemish fashion. We know that Giovanni was quite influenced by the painters from the north. The whole landscape and the details are very Flemish, and there is a whole imagery there with different objects. The great face of Francis, who is in complete ecstasy, in the view of his stigmata on the hand and the feet that he shows too. And then different images around. You have a donkey, that first of all, heavenly Jerusalem shown at the back. And then you have the donkey, which represents humility and patience. Then the burning bush, of course, having to do with the Old Testament, Moses and the great spring, and the transience of life with the skull there. Beautiful and very different is that encounter, embrace between St. Francis and St. Dominic. This is on the kind of pediment at the entrance of the Hospital of St. Paolo in Florence. This is a Andrea della Robbia work. Very tender encounter. And then different works. Moving to Baroque. In Italy, we have Caravaggio with the beautiful St. Francis in ecstasy, where he's held by the angel while being totally lifeless. And these meditational images were meant to inspire the viewer to contemplate his own death and rebirth through Christian devotion. Other works by Caravaggio, St. Francis in Meditation, both very different. One where he's leaning on his hands, always with the skull that reminds you all the time that you're only there for a short period of time. Some followers of Caravaggio, Orazio Gentileschi, the father of Artemisia, showing St. Francis supported by an angel, St. Francis and the angel. Guido Reni, St. Francis consoled by angelic music. And this way of the kind of angelic consolation became quite popular during the 16th century. But we also have to see the impact of Francis, particularly in Spain, where he was incredibly revered. This is a work by Nicolas Francis, that the name tells you he was from France, and shows you a whole series of scenes of the life of St. Francis, but with the center, a virgin and child. And you can see the stigmata, submission of the rules, holding the Lateran palace on his back, so he's following Bonaventura, and then this is in front of the Sultan. Extraordinary retablo. A very different view is by Juan De Flandez, this time a painter from Flanders who came to work in Spain, and shows St. Michael and Francis. Often we will see we have two saints that are not particularly related, but would respond to the patron's desire. Of course, El Greco. And El Greco is often having this conversation between saints. So it has a whole series. This one is on the left is St. Andrew and St. Francis. Very different style, of course, with these elongated shapes and very thought through type of presentation where you really have a conversation between the two. The other one being St. John and Francis, or St. Francis receiving the stigmata. There's more. He did an enormous amount of paintings of St. Francis. And St. Francis' vision of the flaming torch. These are, by the way, the subject is taken from the Little Flowers of St. Francis. So it's another biography and book about it. St. Francis meditating, and St. Francis and Brother Leo, who was one of the closest friends of Francis, meditating on death. Then the very beautiful Bartolome Carduccio, Death of St. Francis, that's incredibly taking, I find, just the grieving of his brethren around him. Beautiful. This is the moment where he dies, and he wants just, he wants to have a candle taken. Now, if you look well, the uniform has changed. You still have the knots that represent what we mentioned, but the hood is very different. And these are now representing the Capuchins, which is a minor order of the friars, the youngest branch of the Franciscan that goes back to 1525. They wanted to live a stricter life of prayer and poverty. By Francisco de Zurbarán, we have also, and again, he's shown as a Capuchin with that very long pointed hood, the 3 knots, as I mentioned before, Meditation of St. Francis or St. Francis. And then by him is that amazing story of Zurbarán, St. Francis in his tomb. This tells the story that in the 1400, the Pope Nicholas V visited the tomb of St. Francis at Assisi at the Basilica. And when they opened the tomb, they saw Francis' face was barely damaged. He looked so realistic. And he had that vision of Francis walking towards him. That was quite extraordinary. And so this is a painting by Zurbarán representing that the whole idea that the Pope saw that very realistic image of Francis. And this was then inspired by Zurbarán, made that Pedro de Mena made that beautiful sculpture of the same moment in polychrome wood. I love these sculptures in Spain at that time. And there's another by Zurbarán of St. Francis of Assisi in his tomb. The St. Francis of Assisi, much more alive. He's with a traditional Franciscan habit, but quite a lively representation of the saint. In the very touching by Murillo, St. Francis embracing the crucified Christ, and it's that beautiful image of again, the same sentence that we saw before. He who does not renounce all he owns cannot follow me. But beautiful represented Christ and Francis with his foot on the globe. In the north, we have different representation. This is one of the stained glass window of the Barfüßerkirche in Erfurt, showing Francis kneeling, receiving the stigmata, as you can see, having the hand and feet in the side. But a beautiful painting that is attributed to Jan van Eyck of St. Francis receiving the stigmata again, but much more Flemish in representation, very detailed. Look at the feet that not only have the stigmata, but you can see he's been walking on his feet, very hardened by the walk, and then beautiful landscape all around. By Isambran, the stigmatization of St. Francis was also almost anthropomorphic landscape in the back. In the 17th century, then we have the very forceful Rubens, who painted many of the paintings representing Francis. This is only 3 of them. This is the stigmatization of Francis in the early work in 1616. The Last Communion of St. Francis, and my gosh, typically Rubens, he's so muscular, which we know he wasn't, and would be very sickly by the time he died. And then the St. Francis of Assisi receiving the stigmata again, very different version. And then, though he didn't, Rembrandt being a Protestant would only use some saints, very few, but just as an educational purpose, but has that absolutely extraordinary view of St. Francis beneath a tree praying, the crucifix that you see there. And of course, he shows Francis as if he was 60, which is quite interesting when we know he died at 44. So On this image, I'm going to let you come out of silence, and I hope you have enjoyed this presentation, though I have, as usual, I had a lot, but hopefully it gives you an idea of what was done and how it evolved. But a man that inspired so much his time, so quickly, had such an impact when he was such a modest man. He never, by the way, became a priest. Many people wanted him to become a priest. He became a deacon, but that's as high as he went. He thought he wasn't worthy becoming a priest. So very modest man with a great impact. So next time on the 8th, we talk about the Nativity Scene. If you have questions, please ask.
Well, I've never known anything about St. Francis, and this was fascinating. Thank you.
He's a fascinating person. He was wild, let's put it that way. He had tremendous charisma, but he had some very strange ideas. And sometimes, I mean, he was completely off the wall. But he came at a time when the church was really going far too intellectual, and he brought back the church to nature and to the simple people. And so it's amazing that he died, and within a day, people were gathering in Assisi to try to get something of him as a memorabilia. So
it's amazing that he was canonized so quickly after he died.
Yes, 2 years after dying, which is totally unusual. But they also knew that it was important for the church. There's a lot of politics going through also with that. You know, politics always invade everything.
Leanne, it's Mary.
Yes.
I seem to recollect that one of the pieces of his life that was a major conversion and turning point for him was when he encountered the leper on the road outside of Assisi. And he had been so scared of leprosy that he had completely avoided anything at all. And they all lived below the city, the lepers.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he got off of his horse and kissed the guy. And it was part of the reason that he changed his life.
And from that time on, he's going to be one of really, that's one of the tasks, the deeds that the Franciscan did, was taking care of these people that were completely ostracized from the city and from any living being. So, and actually many brethren died of it too, by contamination. But he did an amazing work. And the Poor Clares also helped a lot. So he had an incredible impact. And of course, the Basilica, that is superb. I don't know how many of you saw it, but it's extraordinary, was really the making by the Pope. It was very much of a political statement, but is an extraordinary place. Assisi itself is a beautiful town. It's not very large, but it breathes the spirit of St. Francis. When you go there, there is something peaceful about Assisi that is incredible.
The other thing I also remember, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I also remember that Clare and Francis, they're remembered today as being truly mystic. They spent most of their life in meditation. And so they were.
Don't forget, this biography by Bonaventura is the one that gave that imprint, if you want, on the character of Francis, which was not the case with Tommaso Chilano. It has a different view. So the mysticism is a little bit tinted by what the authorities wanted at that time. Yes.
Thank you very much. I mean, this was very thoughtful and very thought out. I mean, this was an outstanding presentation. I love it. And
okay, I hope you've been able to record it. So
I recorded. And now I have three little questions. At the beginning, you said that the Bonaventura biography treated treated Saint Francis as a second coming of the Christ?
No, it's not as a second coming of the Christ, as a second Christ.
A second Christ.
Because he got the stigmata, because he wanted so much to feel Jesus from the inside, if you want. And his life was so dedicated to the poor that he was, in a sense, very much made as a second Christ, not as a second coming, because then you talk about the last judgment.
Oh, okay, okay.
So,
The
but
other thing I did not know, and I had read a lot about St. Francis, was the issue of the cells. You showed a picture. The cells were part of the convent. I always thought that the cells were in the mountains, in the caves. So
no, but the only place where they had these cells and the little huts, as you can see, was around the Portuncola, the tiny little church. So I showed you a plan where you had the little chapel there, and then you had these little huts in which they would live separately. But they also traveled a lot. And then they often lived in caves or wherever the inhabitants would welcome them. But they very quickly, in all these stops that I showed you on the map, they made so many friends that the knight was helping him, and this one was helping him. They became extremely respected and popular. So I think what they did at first, live in these very precarious places, when they were traveling, they were welcome in many places.
and one last thing, I mean, in the El Greco, in Caravaggio, they had, when St. Francis is in meditation, they had a skull. I mean.
Yes, that's always the idea of transition of life.
Okay.
That's that meditation on the afterlife.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, and Francis is not the only one. When you show Saint Jerome, he always has a skull. That's the idea of meditating on the brevity of life. Think, Francis died at 44.
Yeah.
And life was, they had plagues, they had wars, constant war. So life was something, okay, they were reminding them, you might just turn around the corner and you're dead. And so that skull is always there as a reminder that life is just a transition.
Again, thank you so much.
Okay. I hope you enjoyed, and then
Thank you, Anne.
next time,
Thank you,
we
Anne.
said the Nativity on the 8th, and I'm going to work on the school to find out what they're going to do about the program, because I assumed it was up and I haven't had time to look at it yet. But I'll remind them about it.
Thanks, Anne.
Okay, have a great week. And
Thank you.
Bye.
next week. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.